In the autumn of 1917, as the First World War raged across Europe and the Ottoman Empire crumbled, a single letter would reshape the destiny of an entire region. Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour penned what would become known as the Balfour Declaration, promising British support for establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Little did anyone realize that this 67-word document would ignite one of the most enduring conflicts in modern history. Today, as we witness the ongoing tragedy unfolding in Gaza and the West Bank, with thousands of lives lost and millions displaced, we must journey back through time to understand how we arrived at this crossroads. The story begins not with recent events, but with ancient promises, competing claims, and the complex interplay of religion, politics, and nationalism that has defined the Middle East for over a century. To truly comprehend the Israel-Palestine conflict, we must first understand the world that existed before it. For nearly 4 centuries, from 1517 to 1917, the lands we now call Israel and Palestine were part of the vast Ottoman Empire. This was a multicultural realm where Arabs, Jews, Christians, and other minorities coexisted under Ottoman rule, each community maintaining its distinct identity while sharing the same geographic space. By 1914, Jews comprised about 7% of the population, living primarily in the holy cities of Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias. The majority Arab population included Muslims and Christians who had called this land home for generations. Life was far from perfect under Ottoman rule, but there was a certain equilibrium, a delicate balance that would soon be shattered by the winds of change sweeping across Europe. The first cracks in this equilibrium appeared in the 1880s with the arrival of the first Aliyah, the first wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine. Driven by growing anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe and inspired by the emerging Zionist movement, thousands of Jewish immigrants began arriving in Ottoman Palestine. The history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict traces back to the late 19th century when Zionists sought to establish a homeland for the Jewish people in Ottoman-controlled Palestine. What made this immigration different from previous Jewish settlement was its ideological foundation. These weren't merely religious pilgrims seeking to pray at holy sites. They were settlers with a political vision. They came with the dream of creating a Jewish state, purchasing land, establishing agricultural settlements, and building the infrastructure of a future nation. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 would prove to be the catalyst that transformed local tensions into a global conflict. The Ottoman Empire, joining the Central Powers, found itself at war with Britain and France. British strategists, looking for ways to weaken Ottoman control over the Middle East, began making promises to various groups that would later prove impossible to reconcile. The most famous of these promises was the Balfour Declaration of November 2, 1917, Second Baron Rothschild stating Britain's support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and including the crucial caveat that nothing shall be done, which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. It was made in a letter dated November 2, 1917, from Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, to Lionel Walter Rothschild, and promised the French government territorial concessions in the same region. The language was carefully crafted but deliberately ambiguous, speaking of a national home rather than a state. But here's where the story becomes truly complex. When the Balfour Declaration was signed, the British had already promised Palestine to Arabs as an independent state. This diplomatic juggling act would set the stage for decades of conflict. The British were essentially making 3 mutually exclusive promises: to the Arabs for independence, to the Jews for a homeland, and to the French for territorial control. With the Ottoman Empire's defeat in 1918, Britain found itself in control of Palestine under a League of Nations mandate. The British now faced the impossible task of implementing the Balfour Declaration, while maintaining peace between increasingly hostile communities. To coordinate their political response to these changes, it required the mandatory to facilitate Jewish immigration into Palestine, setting the stage for demographic transformation that would fundamentally alter the region's character. The numbers tell a compelling story. Between 1922 and 1935, the Jewish population rose from 9% to nearly 27% of the total population. This wasn't merely statistical change. It represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power, economic control, and political influence in Palestine. The Arab population watched with growing alarm as Jewish immigration accelerated. Land was purchased by Zionist organizations, and Hebrew began to compete with Arabic as the language of commerce and administration. The systematic murder of 6 million European Jews created both a moral imperative for Jewish statehood and a massive refugee crisis that would reshape Palestine as demographics. In December 1920, Palestinian Arabs at a congress in Haifa established an executive committee. What followed were decades of escalating tensions, periodic violence, and failed attempts at compromise. The 1929 riots, the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, and the increasing militarization of both communities created a cycle of violence that British authorities found increasingly difficult to control. Each outbreak of violence deepened the divide between Arabs and Jews, making peaceful coexistence seem ever more elusive. The United Nations resolution sparked conflict between Jewish and Arab groups within Palestine, setting the stage for the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The Nazi Holocaust fundamentally altered the calculus of the Palestine question. Holocaust survivors, having lost everything, saw Palestine not just as a homeland but as the only sanctuary where they could rebuild their lives and ensure their survival. By 1947, Britain, exhausted by war and unable to manage the escalating conflict in Palestine, turned the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. The UN Partition Plan, passed in November 1947, proposed dividing Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international control. The plan allocated approximately 55% of the territory to the proposed Jewish state, DESPITE Jews comprising only about one-third of the population. The Jewish leadership, led by David Ben-Gurion, accepted the partition plan, seeing it as the culmination of decades of Zionist efforts. The Arab leadership, however, rejected it outright, viewing it as an unjust division of their homeland. Israel's stunning military victory resulted in the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the Sinai Peninsula. It was the first time the two sides recognized each other. Israel declared its independence on May 14, 1948. The declaration was followed by an invasion by neighboring Arab states, including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. The occupation, initially seen as a temporary military administration, has now lasted over 5 decades and has become a defining feature of the conflict. Instead, it became a laboratory for the conflict's most destructive dynamics. The war resulted in Israel's survival and expansion of territory. But this victory came at an enormous cost for the Palestinian Arab population. An estimated 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes, creating a refugee crisis that persists to this day, and temporary ceasefires that solve nothing while the underlying issues remain unaddressed. The 1948 war established Israel as a fact on the ground, but it also created the Palestinian refugee problem that would become central to the ongoing conflict. Those who fled or were expelled found themselves in refugee camps in neighboring Arab countries, waiting for what they believed would be a temporary exile. Decades later, these temporary camps have become permanent cities, home to multiple generations who have never seen the land their grandparents called home. The 1967 Six-Day War brought another dramatic transformation to the region. For the first time since 1948, significant Palestinian populations found themselves under Israeli control. In 1993, Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accords, which aimed to achieve peace within 5 years. The handshake on the White House lawn seemed to herald a new era of peace, but the optimism of Oslo gradually gave way to disillusionment as negotiations stalled and violence resumed. The withdrawal of Israeli settlers and military forces from Gaza in 2005 was supposed to be a step toward peace. In 2005, Israel withdrew its settlers and troops from Gaza while retaining control over its borders, seashore, and airspace. Major fighting flared between Israel and Palestinian militants in Gaza in 2006, 2008, 2012, 2014, and 2021. Each round of violence has followed a familiar pattern: militant attacks, Israeli military responses, civilian casualties, international condemnation. The October 7, 2023 attacks by Hamas marked a new and horrific chapter in this cycle. The unprecedented scale of the attack, with over 1,000 Israelis killed and hundreds taken hostage, triggered an Israeli military response of unprecedented intensity. In January 2024, under pressure from its principal ally, the United States, and amid global scrutiny both over the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and doubts about the feasibility of completely eradicating Hamas, Israel signaled its intent to shift to lower-intensity operations in Gaza. The Israel-Palestine conflict has never existed in isolation. Regional powers have consistently used the Palestinian cause to advance their own interests, often at the expense of Palestinian aspirations. The Abraham Accords, signed during the Trump administration, represented a significant shift in regional dynamics, with several Arab states normalizing relations with Israel without resolving the Palestinian question. This normalization process revealed the extent to which the Palestinian cause had become marginalized in regional politics. Countries like the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco prioritized their own economic and security interests over Palestinian solidarity. The promise of American benefits for recognizing Israel proved more attractive than maintaining the traditional Arab consensus on Palestinian rights. Iran's role in this equation cannot be understated. As Sunni Arab states moved closer to Israel, Iran positioned itself as the champion of Palestinian resistance, supporting groups like Hamas and Hezbollah as part of its broader strategy to counter Israeli and American influence in the region. This has turned the Israel-Palestine conflict into a proxy battleground for larger regional rivalries. The international community, as response to the Israel-Palestine conflict, has been characterized by legal principles consistently undermined by political realities. In July 2024, the International Court of Justice determined that Israeli policies violate the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Yet such legal determinations often have little practical impact on the ground. But the culmination of over a century of competing nationalisms, unfulfilled promises, and missed opportunities for peace. The United Nations has passed hundreds of resolutions concerning the conflict, calling for withdrawal from occupied territories, recognizing Palestinian rights, and condemning violations of international law. However, the enforcement of these resolutions has proven problematic, due to the complex dynamics of international politics and the strategic importance of the region. But in the way it has transformed two peoples with legitimate claims to the same land into seemingly permanent enemies. As we watch today's headlines unfold, it's crucial to understand that the current crisis is not the result of recent events alone. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has claimed tens of thousands of lives and displaced many millions of people and has its roots in a colonial act carried out more than a century ago. The tragedy of this conflict lies not just in the lives lost or the suffering endured. Both Israelis and Palestinians have experienced trauma, displacement, and loss. Both have legitimate historical connections to the land. Both have made sacrifices for their national aspirations. Yet the zero-sum nature of the conflict has made it increasingly difficult to envision a solution that addresses the fundamental needs and rights of both peoples. The extremes on both sides have grown stronger, while the voices of moderation have been marginalized. And the reconciliation between former enemies in Europe after World War I all demonstrate that peace is possible even after decades of conflict. The space for compromise has narrowed as the conflict has become more entrenched and militarized. And military operation are human beings whose lives have been shaped by forces beyond their control. History teaches us that conflicts, no matter how intractable they may seem, can be resolved when there is genuine political will, international support, and recognition of shared humanity. The Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, the end of apartheid in South Africa. The Israel-Palestine conflict requires a similar commitment to peace, justice, and mutual recognition. It demands leaders on both sides who are willing to make difficult compromises, an international community committed to supporting peace rather than taking sides, and civil societies that choose dialogue over violence. The story of Israel and Palestine is ultimately a human story, one of two peoples who have suffered greatly and who deserve to live in peace and security. Understanding this history doesn't provide easy answers, but it does remind us that behind every political statement, as we continue to witness the unfolding of this ancient conflict in our modern world, we must remember that history is not destiny. The choices made today will determine whether future generations inherit a legacy of continued conflict or the possibility of peace. The lessons of the past century show us both the dangers of extremism and the potential for human reconciliation. Which path will be chosen remains to be seen, but the stakes could not be higher for all who call this contested land home. The Israel-Palestine conflict remains one of the most complex and emotionally charged issues of our time. Its resolution will require not just political solutions, but a fundamental transformation in how both people see themselves and each other. Only by understanding the deep historical roots of this conflict can we begin to imagine a future where the children of Abraham can live together in peace in the land they both call home.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more engaging historical content.